As the modern seafaring traveler glides towards the Mediterranean shore, the dark sea brightens to become a sparkling turquoise pool. Ancient rocks line the coast and glisten in the sun, remnants of great civilizations that once flourished here. The Mediterranean Sea has been nourishing civilization for thousands of years. It is the world's largest sea. Great gods and goddesses once were said to rule these waters and the lands around them. They also ruled the heavens and the mysterious underground caverns where the dead were said to dwell forever. Homer's contemporary Hesiod, writing in about 700 BCE, described a god named Oceanus, who was said to have been the father of all fresh waters.
There are many daughters of Oceanus and his wife Tethys, 3,000 nymphs with shapely ankles, who are scattered everywhere over the earth.
Among these children of Oceanus were the Nile, Tigris, and Euphrates rivers. These rivers in turn were the locations of history's earliest civilizations. Long before these civilizations developed some 40,000 years ago, the human species became fully developed and began to practice rites of passage, apparently to serve a basic human need for ritual activity. Their artwork reflected frequent indulgence in ritual. All these images reflected their belief in a world filled with spirits or animae, with which they could communicate. Through worship and sacrifice, these people strived to appease these animistic spirits so that they would ensure fertility, luck, prosperity, and survival. These early humans migrated by foot or by raft around the world, walking or rafting over the shallow passes created by a rising and falling sea level. This changing sea level was caused by the beginning and ending of various ice ages over tens of thousands of years. As the first agricultural civilizations emerged, human spirituality also underwent a parallel evolution. The savage animal spirits from the age of hunting and gathering now became domesticated spirits of the farm. Neolithic farmers mostly worshipped the largest and most powerful of domesticated land animals, the bull. The bull became the chief male deity. Neolithic humans also worshipped a fertility goddess. All of this worship was to ensure fertile land and good health for the crops, the animals, and for humans. Above all, the Neolithic farmer wanted to maintain a natural harmony between the Earth's animals, its crops, and the sun and the rain that are so vital for fertility and growth. This desire for cosmic harmony was the motivating force behind primitive spirituality. Just as the harvest produced food for the coming season and seeds for the next, death for humans signaled the harvesting and rebirth of the spirit. The harmony of nature was comprehensive, and the sun and moon in the heavens were in a sense believed to represent the bulls and cows on their farms. Ancient rituals reflected this harmony, and no doubt these primitive cultures created myths as a way to explain the cosmic order. In the delta between the Tigris and the Euphrates, the first Bronze Age civilization emerged in about 3000 BCE. These were the city-states of Sumer, and this Mesopotamian civilization marked the beginning of recorded history. One of the world's first historians was an unknown writer who, by about 2000 BCE, wrote a creation poem describing the birth of his homeland, Sumeria.
When on high heaven had yet no name, when below the earth had yet no name, there was only Apsu, the primeval, sweet water, their father, and Tiamat, the salt water who mothered them, their waters commingled as one.
This creation myth survived and spread because some 1,000 years earlier, around 3000 BCE, the Sumerians had invented a system of writing called cuneiform. Cuneiform had been first used to maintain inventories, but then the Sumerians used it to record both their dedications to the gods and their myths as well.
That's the remarkable thing about Sumer. Their greatest contribution was probably their language. The language of Sumer and the cuneiform writing system of the Sumerians survived the fall of the Sumerian Empire and went on to be used by most, if not all, of the other civilizations and peoples in Mesopotamia as a scholarly language, just the way that Latin survived the fall of the Roman Empire to become the language of scholars throughout the Middle Ages.
They recorded vivid portrayals of gods and goddesses who ruled the heavens, controlled human existence, and determined the course of empires. Sumerian culture was a great advance for human civilization. Urban developments such as Ur, Larsa, and Kish emerged. They created a system of law and government to control the sophisticated irrigation systems that were increasing their farm production. Cities became the economic, political, and religious centers of Sumerian culture. There's little doubt that during the earlier Neolithic period, local chiefs had served as both political and spiritual leaders. Now, in the Bronze Age, the chiefs were powerful priest-kings in charge not only of aggressive armies, but also of complex economies and large populations. These kings often assumed priestly functions in the cities they conquered. They served the gods, and the gods in turn were believed to serve the kings.
Sumer was made up really of a collection of city-states, and each one of these city-states was ruled by a specific god or goddess. For example, the patron god of the city of Sircar would have been the god Utu, who was a sun god. The god of the city of Eridu was the god Enki, who was a god of wisdom. He was also the god of the waters. The god of the city Ur was the god Nana, who was associated with the moon. The great city-state of Uruk was ruled by its matron deity Inanna, the great goddess who was called the Queen of Heaven and Earth.
At the end of the day, the radiant star, the great light that fills the sky, the Lady of the Evening appears in the heavens. The people in all the lands lift their eyes to her. Holy Inanna, the Lady of the Evening, makes them hurry to their sleeping places. The living creatures and the numerous people of Sumer kneel before her. There is great joy in Sumer. The young man makes love with his beloved. The lady of the evening is radiant on the horizon.
In time, the Sumerians yielded power in Mesopotamia to a neighboring people in the west called Semites. From the moment the Semites emerged on the eastern shore of the Mediterranean basin, their mythology and religion influenced the world. Ultimately, that influence would give rise to Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. A Semitic king named Sargon, along with his grandson Naram-Sin, founded the first Semitic dynasty in about 2300 BCE. The successor to Sargon and Naram-Sin was a Semite ruler called Hammurabi, who lived in the 18th century BCE. Hammurabi governed what would come to be the best known and the most influential Semitic city in the second millennium BCE, Babylon. The magnificent city of Babylon was located on the banks of the Euphrates River. Hammurabi's famed code of law made it a model of civil administration.
And it was a very complex law, a law that dealt with many kinds of issues, a lot of commercial issues. It involved what we might describe as the Law of Retaliation, that is an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, which sounds a bit harsh when you think about it at first, but if you think about it a little bit more, it's probably less harsh than it sounds. If someone were to poke your eye out, or worse, perhaps your child's eye, your inclination would be to do much more than retaliate by poking out the eye. But the law says, you shall do no more than an eye for an eye or a tooth for a tooth.
The city also served as the religious center for hundreds of years, conducting a splendid New Year's festival to celebrate the great god Marduk. Archaeologists have found many of the cuneiform tablets on which Babylonian scribes recorded their great mythological epics. Among the most fascinating of these epics is an ancient account of the myth of Gilgamesh.
Of course, at the beginning of the story, we get a description of Gilgamesh, and the epic describes him as 2/3 god and 1/3 human, whereas Enkidu, the monster sent by the gods to kill Gilgamesh, is described as part animal and part human. And it's really a story of the two of them growing human together. The part that I find most moving is when Enkidu approaches the city of Uruk, and Gilgamesh goes out to confront him just outside the walls of the city. The two of them become involved in an incredibly violent battle, and they fight to the point of exhaustion. And they recognize that each is as strong as the other. And then all of a sudden, Gilgamesh leans on the shoulder of Enkidu and looks into his eye and sees himself, just as Enkidu looks into Gilgamesh's eye and sees himself in Gilgamesh. And the two of them became friends.
Their temple was a towering ziggurat adorned with cypress wood, inlaid stones, and frescoed plaster. Archaeologists believe this building was probably about 15 stories high, an extraordinary height for the ancient Near East. Hebrew scriptures would later refer to this ziggurat as the Tower of Babel.
And that particular ziggurat, the Tower of Babel, was probably built in the 6th century BC, so we have a long period of time when that style of architecture persisted. They looked vaguely like the pyramids of ancient Egypt, but their purpose was totally different. The pyramids in ancient Egypt were burial monuments for the kings of Egypt, whereas the ziggurats were high places, literally high places, where people could get closer to the gods for the purpose of communicating with the gods.
Precious little remains of Babylon's mud brick foundations. 4,000 years of flooding and erosion have erased most traces of the city. While civilization flourished in Mesopotamia, many miles to the southwest, another mighty Bronze Age kingdom was emerging. King Menes had united Upper and Lower Egypt in 3100 BCE. to create the incipient Empire of the Two Lands. Throughout many Egyptian dynasties, the militant pharaohs spent a great deal of effort and money to consolidate their conquests, their control of trade routes, and their overall extended influence, all supposedly to honor Egypt's nationally recognized divinities. Each city was its own religious center, and each propagated its own creation myth. In Thebes, for example, the world was believed to be descended from Amun, who was said to be too great to examine and too powerful to understand. In Heliopolis, worshippers believed the universe had descended from Nu, the primordial waters of nothingness and chaos. Nu lay beyond the sun and the netherworld, surrounding the cosmos. The world as we live in it was said to have begun when Atum, lord of Heliopolis, stood atop a raised pyramid in the form of a sun. These various divinities proliferated in number and function, yet they remained remarkably constant for more than 3,000 years. Many Egyptian gods retained traces of Neolithic animism. While some of these gods were associated with the sun, others were associated with animals. They often were depicted either as animals or as hybrid humans with animal heads. Sekhmet, goddess of war, had the head of a lion. The Sphinx, a hybrid spirit found in Mesopotamia, Egypt, and Greece, had the body of a winged lion and a human head, usually female. The surviving Egyptian hymns to the gods reflect a beautiful sense of devotion. For example, one hymn from Thebes is dedicated to Hathor, goddess of the sky and mistress of love.
O you lords of the western sky, O you gods of the western sky, O you who rule the shores of the western sky, who rejoice in Hathor's coming, who love to see her beauty rise, I let her know. I say at her side that I rejoice in seeing her. My hands do, come to me, come to me. My body says, my lips repeat holy music for Hathor. Music 1,000,000 times because you love music. 1,000,000 times music to your spiritual double, your Ka, wherever you are.
Over several millennia, Egyptians maintained an unwavering focus on the afterlife. The afterlife offered every person the ideal of spiritual immortality. It served to stabilize their lives, their culture, and their kingdom.
Well, it really amazes me how consistent the Egyptians were when you look, for example, at their style of art, which, with very few exceptions, was quite consistent for that entire 3,000-year period of ancient history. And I think the reason is that the Egyptians placed a very high value on permanence and timelessness. They worked really hard at it. Can you think, for example, of any architectural style that would be more lasting than a pyramid? The Egyptians worked very hard at preserving the bodies of the dead through the process of mummification.
Egyptian families spent fortunes on mummification to preserve the body for eternal life, and they maintained tombs for several generations after the deceased had entered the kingdom of the dead. The Egyptians called the physical body the Chet, the spiritual body was the Sah, and the heart was called the Ib. They believed that in burying the body, the Chet, they also buried the Sah and the Ib, that is the spirit and the heart. The image of the deceased was called the Ka, and it was not believed to be buried. The Ka usually was thought to be housed in statues of the deceased, and it received the offerings of food, wine, oils, and burnt incense. Often priests and even whole chapels were assigned to the Ka of a deceased person. Egyptian religion also recognized the Ba, or soul, the Chaybit, or shadow, the Khu, or intelligence, and the Sechem, or form. Such conceptual richness and depth testifies to the strength of the Egyptian attempt to comprehend the afterlife, which supplanted other religious ideas like belief in a future golden age on Earth or belief in the end of the cosmos. The 13th century BCE was a fateful time for the Egyptians, now persistently attacked by various peoples of the Mediterranean Sea, and the Egyptian Empire entered a period of eclipse for several hundred years. Sometime around 1600 BCE, a second wave of Semitic tribes began to flourish to the west along the eastern coast of the Mediterranean. This was the area that later would be variously called the Levant, Syria-Palestine, or Canaan. These Semites also have been known by tribal names like Phoenicians, Canaanites, and Hebrews. The Phoenicians lived mainly in the cities of Tyre and Sidon, along the central part of the coast. However, they were not at all content to remain at home. As a nation, they never mounted massive expeditionary forces or controlled vast military empires. They conquered the Mediterranean with merchant ships and colonists. Over 1,000 years, Phoenician ships and colonists spread to Cyprus, Greece, Sicily, Malta, North Africa, and Spain. They even expanded beyond the Straits of Gibraltar, known in ancient mythology as the Pillars of Hercules. They gathered tin from the mines in Cornwall, a part of modern England, and they ventured into the South Atlantic towards the equator. On their frequent voyages around the Mediterranean, the Phoenicians carried two important non-commercial exports: their alphabet and their religion. Their alphabet, the first ever to be invented, emerged in about 1400 BCE. It was a vast improvement over the cumbersome, imprecise cuneiform and hieroglyphic writing systems of Mesopotamia and Egypt. The Phoenician alphabet would later become the basis of the Greek and Roman alphabets, and it inspired the later development of the English alphabet. The main Phoenician god was Baal, or Bel.
Well, the term Baal actually refers to a number of fertility gods of the Canaanites and the Phoenicians. The Canaanites were primarily agricultural people, and so they worshipped a variety of agricultural gods and fertility gods. Baal was the god of storms and the god of rain. And as the god of rain, he fertilized the cattle in the fields, for example, by his rain to make the cattle fat. We learn an awful lot about these Baal gods in Phoenician texts from the royal city of Ugarit. And these texts give us an image of Baal, which almost ironically portray him in having some of the same characteristics as the God of the Bible. For example, being the god of the storms, Baal rides on clouds, just like Psalm 104 tells us that the God of the Bible rides on clouds and on the wind. Baal, like the God of the Bible, was a judge and ensured justice. And I think these close parallels suggest that the ancient Israelites, especially during the 8th and 9th centuries, really struggled within themselves for their allegiance to one God or the other God.
The Hebrews later migrated to what the Bible calls the land of milk and honey. This is the area known as Canaan, Palestine, and since 1948, Israel. Amid the turmoil of the 13th and 12th centuries BCE, a number of Hittite cuneiform letters mention a group of people from the west named the Ahiawans. The Egyptians called them Ekwesh, and Homer called them Achaeans. History calls them Greeks.
The Greeks show up in Greece in about 1600 BC. We distinguish them from their predecessors in Greece because they speak Greek, which their predecessors didn't, and they worship the Greek gods and goddesses, the folks we come to call Zeus and Hera and Athena and the rest. They're in Greece, established themselves about 1600, and then over the course of the next couple of hundred years become very powerful and very wealthy. A lot of that power and wealth is based in their military skills and being able to fight well against invaders and more, actually, often foreign shores as mercenaries, and also their wealth comes from trade. And in that way, they're very much like the Phoenicians, trading especially in the Eastern Mediterranean and in the West, too. We know that these Bronze Age Greeks went as far west as Italy because we have some of their pottery there, just as we have some of their pottery in the eastern part of the world.
Archaeologists have found that these Bronze Age Greeks, usually called Mycenaean Greeks, traded and fought throughout the Mediterranean basin. They flourished between 1600 and 1200 BCE, bringing their riches and plunder back to the citadels at Mycenae, Tiryns, Thebes, Orchomenos, and Pylos. The Mycenaean Greeks sometimes hired themselves out as overseas mercenaries. On one such adventure, they saw the great tombs of Egypt. They witnessed Egypt's mystical rites for preparing the deceased for the afterlife. Impressed by this ritual, the Mycenaean Greeks adapted their own beliefs. By the end of the 13th century BCE, the Mycenaean citadels, the Hittite capital in Anatolia, and the Mesopotamian city of Ugarit lay in ruins. Pirates roamed the Mediterranean, and the great Bronze Age civilizations had collapsed under their own militaristic weight. It would be centuries before Greece would exhibit anything stronger than a faint pulse.
It's a matter of great scholarly debate as to why the Dark Age occurred, why it was that these great political and administrative and military centers around Greece collapsed. One scholar by the name of Robert Drews has suggested that in fact it was the lower classes, the working men, the folks who served in the second ranks of the army, who became very powerful and were able to overtake these communities, take over the citadels and fortified places from the folks who'd previously been rulers. And as a result of that upheaval, which Drews believe is universal throughout the Eastern Mediterranean, we find the crashing down, almost literally in the case of some of these communities, but figuratively in the case of others, this culture of the late Bronze Age. And much of what was part of that culture, these large fortified citadels, these centralized governments, these archives and storage rooms, needed behind them vast numbers of workers and writing too, to keep records of these things. And once all of those things were gone, the need for writing disappeared. And so we get literally a dark age in which there is no account, no written account of what happened.
The Greeks suffered terribly after Mycenaean civilization collapsed near the end of the Bronze Age. They abandoned the cities in droves, returning to small farm plots or sailing the seas in search of a livelihood. Greece lost as much as 90% of its population. Survivors lived in poverty and ignorance. Small pockets of Greek culture remained alive both in Athens and across the Aegean Sea, in communities along the Ionian coast of Anatolia. Here the Greeks preserved the memory of the glorious Bronze Age by formulating the epic stories of the Iliad and the Odyssey. By 800 BCE, Greece's population began to grow again. Her sailors began trading with the Phoenicians. They learned the Phoenician alphabet and returned home to spread their newfound knowledge. Greek culture began to flourish, producing an era known as the Geometric Age. That is the 9th and 8th centuries BCE, a time characterized by sculpture and vase painting decorated with geometric lines and curves that represented both abstract and human forms. The Greeks began using the Phoenician alphabet to record poems dedicated to the gods. Eventually, they would write the great heroic epics, including those attributed to Homer. Although the Greek city-states were highly competitive and bellicose, they began meeting together every 4 years in newly established pan-Hellenic sanctuaries, which essentially were national gathering places. Here the Greeks honored their gods by competing against one another in athletic and poetic contests. They also sang hymns of praise to the gods.
Sing to me, O Muse, of the works of golden Aphrodite, who stirs sweet longings in gods and subdues the races of mortal men, as well as the birds from the sky and all the beasts that are nurtured in their multitudes on both land and sea.
Both Hesiod and Homer used their typically keen Greek intellects to modify and enhance age-old epic stories, which had been orally transmitted since the Bronze Age.
The Iliad and Odyssey cannot be underestimated in any way for the influence they played in Greek culture. It was from the pages of Homer, from the Iliad and the Odyssey, that later poets drew characters and situations for their poems and for their dramatic plays. It's from Homer, too, that vase painters and sculptors drew scenes and characters for what they created, so that many of the vases, for instance, painted in Athens in the 6th and 5th centuries BC, draw from Homer the characters of the great heroes, Odysseus and Theseus and Heracles and Achilles, many of whom are celebrated and sung about in Homer's poems.
While Homer sang tales of the Trojan War, Hesiod sang songs of the world's creation. Homer and Hesiod thus preserved the religious traditions of the Bronze Age by restating them in terms that reflected the intellectual advancements of their own era. Indigenous Greek divinities included Hera, the fertility goddess of marriage and childbirth, who was worshipped in the fertile agricultural plain of Argos. There was Demeter, the goddess of agriculture, who ruled the annual crop cycles of life and death. And Artemis, the goddess most like Mother Nature, was worshipped at Delos and at Ephesus in Anatolia. Among the Greek divinities derived from foreign sources were Apollo from the north, Aphrodite, based on Ishtar from the east, and the storm god Zeus, derived from Indo-European culture in general. A century or so after Homer, the Athenians, in about 600 BCE, would collect these and other divinities into a canonized pantheon of 12 Olympian gods. As Greek culture continued to flourish, the Greek gods increasingly came to be creations of art, rather than inspirations for worship. The Greeks learned from Egyptians how to build huge temples of stone. But these temples weren't congregational halls. They were lavish buildings to house statues of the gods. The Greeks decorated these temples with carefully carved fluted columns, pedimental sculptures over the entrance and the rear, and a beautiful cult statue inside. Inspired by Egyptian architecture and driven by innate artistry, the Greeks sought pure form and line. They found the perfect construction material for their art right at home, in their own native marble. It took a century or two for the Greeks to perfect their techniques with marble. Then the Athenians summoned a great deal of energy, money, and artistic skill to build what was perhaps the most magnificent temple ever built, the Parthenon. On all 4 of the Parthenon's exterior sides, square relief sculptures glorified Athens and her gods. Inside, the Parthenon was enclosed and dark. Solid marble walls shut off the exterior colonnade, and the interior space was greatly reduced. Here was an enormous statue covered in gold and ivory, an image that towered over visitors. This was Athena Parthenos, the goddess of wisdom, whose name means Athena the Virgin.
Pallas Athena, I shall thee sing, the glorious goddess whose eyes gleam, brilliantly inventive, her heart relentless, formidable maiden, guardian of the cities, now and in another song, I will remember you.
The Parthenon was dedicated as a temple, though it glorified the human race through human artistry. Homer had portrayed the gods as immediate and accessible beings, walking and talking on the battlefield of Troy. For every important human action, there was a parallel divine action. But these gods no longer satisfied the needs of democratized Athenian life. By and large, Greeks began to look for answers not from the gods, but from philosophy. At this point in history, about the 4th century BCE, Greek culture, religion, and philosophy was relatively free of outside influence. Then a neighbor from Macedonia to the north, Alexander the Great, invaded Greece and Persia.
Alexander's father, Philip, was determined to raise his son to be a king. And so he provided the very best tutors that were available, including the famous Aristotle. So Alexander's education was a well-rounded one and included not only philosophy and poetry and music, but also politics and military tactics.
He was an 18-year-old, charismatic general, and his success presented a serious challenge to the traditional Greek sense of theology. Egyptians recognized Alexander as their new pharaoh. Persians hailed him as their new king of kings. To these subservient peoples of the East, Alexander was God on earth, and he allowed them to worship him. But in one of the most notorious episodes of his brief but brilliant career, Alexander notified the Athenians that they also would have to worship him as a god. They refused.
It is wrong to ignore the distinctions between men and gods. We should not make a man look bigger than he is by paying him excessive honor, or, at the same time, impiously to degrade the gods by putting them on the same level as men.
Still, Alexander's divine ambition was to be the beginning of a long series of Eastern theological intrusions on the ancient Greco-Roman world. Alexander died in Babylon at the age of only 33. By then, the Greek civilizations of the Eastern Mediterranean had become quite cosmopolitan. More than a dozen cities named Alexandria dotted the Mediterranean and the Near East. Each boasted its own symbol of Greek culture, usually a theater or a stadium. The most important of these cities was in Egypt. Here, Alexander's successors established a new kind of temple dedicated to the arts and sciences. They called it a museion, or museum, because it was dedicated to the 9 muses, the goddesses of the arts.
This temple to the Muses housed a library, one of the very first large-scale libraries that we know about from antiquity. In this library, there were many scholars at work, rather like modern graduate students and scholars, and they copied and studied and commented on ancient works of literature, including the poems of Homer and the poems that were written in the 5th century at the height of Athenian classical period. These scholars studied these works at the library in Alexandria. They cataloged them, they organized them, they wrote in the margins of the books. And this library came to be a great scholarly center.
Yet another subculture was taking root in the peninsula we now know as Italy. The most successful of these Italic peoples were the Romans, who shared many cultural traits with their Indo-European cousins. They worshipped a powerful thunderbolt-throwing storm god. In the original Indo-European language, the name of this storm god was Diaus, while the Greek pronunciation was Zeus, and the Latin version was Eu. To the name Eu, the Romans then added their word for father, pater, to arrive at the name of their own storm god, Jupiter, or as we call him today, Jupiter. For its first few hundred years, from about 500 to 50 BCE, the Roman Republic defended and expanded its territories. The cultural similarities between the Greeks and Romans were reinforced when the Romans conquered Greece itself in 146 BCE. They drained Greece of its artwork, poetry, and thinkers, adapting it as much as possible to the Latin language and their Italic style.
In many cases, they borrowed the gods and goddesses outright in their appearance, and in the case of Apollo, for instance, in name too. In other cases, they combined these gods and goddesses with local, native Italic deities.
The Romans found local Italic equivalents for the 12 Greek Olympian gods. For example, the Roman god Neptune was equated with Poseidon, the god of the sea. Mercury was associated with Hermes, the Greek god who led dead souls to Hades. Venus was equated with the Greek Aphrodite, goddess of love.
At last love has come. I prayed to the muse and won. Venus dropped him in my arms, doing for me what she has promised. Let my joy be told. Let those who have none tell it in a story. We met. We are both worthy.
The Roman Empire was a religious melting pot. Its huge size made for a wide range of influences.
But you, Roman, must remember that you have to guide the nations by your authority. For this is to be your skill, to graft tradition into peace, to show mercy to the conquered, and to wage war until the haughty are brought low.
Many cults and religions were assimilated into this patchwork. The Egyptian people continued to be much like their ancestors, who for millennia had worshipped their pharaohs as gods. Rome itself had a cult devoted to Augustus's adoptive father, Julius Caesar. Rome's cult of the emperor spread all over the empire within a few decades. But one group of worshippers stood out in its refusal to recognize this royal cult. This was a sect of Palestinian Jews who believed in a savior they called Christ. At first, Christianity was only one of many cults in the lands conquered by Rome. In the 4th century CE, Emperor Constantine issued the Edict of Milan, making Christianity an accepted religion of the Roman Empire. Later, it became the official religion of Rome. Yet many centuries after Christianity began this era of predominance, old pagan traditions still affected Christian iconography, as Greco-Roman mythical heroes were depicted in Judeo-Christian art. It would take centuries, but ultimately the ancient myths and religions of the Mediterranean yielded entirely to a new order. The 3 great Western religions of Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, each of them monotheistic, eventually would supplant the polytheistic religions and mythologies that had thrived in Greece, Rome, Egypt, and the lands of the Near East. Throughout ancient times and well beyond, myths were powerful ways of explaining the world. Myths, at least, attempted to explain what people otherwise could not understand. In symbolic or spiritual terms, the insights of ancient mythology sometimes rival or perhaps exceed the most profound theology of our modern scientific age. Few now worship the mythological deities of early Mediterranean civilization, but the beliefs and commitments formed at the dawn of Western history still shape us in powerful yet invisible ways.
Mm.